Alright, welcome to this review video. We're going to be doing Psychological Egoism Part 2. Last time we got clear on what exactly psychological egoism says, and we looked at a couple of bad arguments for psychological egoism. This time we are going to discuss what I think is a better argument, but I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think it is ultimately a good argument for psychological egoism. The argument is inspired by a very influential text in the history of Western philosophy, Plato's Republic. There's Plato on the left-hand side, and in the middle there you've got one of the oldest, I believe, written Greek manuscripts of the Republic. The central question of the Republic is, what is justice? And there are two threads running through the text. What is justice in a city or a society? And the question there is roughly what is social justice or political justice? And then the other question is, what is justice in a soul or in an individual person? What is a just person? And justice for Plato and for the Greeks, for our purposes, we're going to understand as something like morality, something like in an individual person, the quality of being a morally good individual. And the text that we read from Book 2 of the Republic begins to ask about that second subject, a soul or a person. What is it to be a good person? What is it to be morally virtuous or just, as they put it? In Book 2, the beginning question is not just what is it to be just, but Glaucon and Socrates are beginning to lay down some ground rules for the rest of the Republic. Book 2 is 2 of 10, so they have a long way to go. And one thing that's really important for Plato, the author, and that he has the character of Socrates emphasize throughout, is that their account of what justice or morality or being a good person is, their theory of the nature of moral goodness, should explain why it is that we seem to have reason to be moral. What is justice such that it has this quality or property of giving us reason to do it, right? If you think about every other fact, every other feature of the world that can be scientifically studied, say, the property of having a particular mass, that's a property of this table that I'm at, this desk, that doesn't give me a reason all by itself, the fact that the table has a mass of such and such, to do anything. By contrast, if some things are just and some things are unjust, justness seems to have within it this motivational factor. It gives us reason to do it. And they want an account of justice that illuminates that quality. At the very outset, what you get is Socrates laying out really threefold category of what we're later going to call values. He puts it in terms of what's choice-worthy or what is desirable. And he notes that some things seem to be desirable for their own sake. Other things seem to be desirable only as a means to some end. He also mentions a third category we're going to put to the side when we get to Aristotle. As we'll see, Aristotle picks up this third category and thinks it's really important. For our purposes, though, Socrates and Glaucon at the outset of Book 2 are distinguishing between things that are desirable as a means to an end, like money, You only want money in order to get something with it, and things that are desirable for their own sake. And the question that they begin with is, in which category do we put justice? And Socrates, at least, says this: I myself put it, and by it he means justice, in the finest category. The one that anyone who is going to be blessed with happiness must love both because of itself and because of its consequences. And so he's actually putting it in that third category. Our focus, though, is going to be on this bit of his claim, that forget about the consequences part. He says justice is something that, in order to be blessed with happiness, one must love at least because of itself. A lot of the rest of the Republic is figuring out how you can have both something that's loved for its consequences and in and of itself. Socrates' thesis is, for our purposes, to simplify, we love and desire justice, at least sometimes, for its own sake. So we're going to couch Socrates' opening thesis as follows. Here's how we're going to put it. I'm trying to sort of translate a bit of this into our terminology that we laid out when we discussed egoism. Just and moral behavior is at least sometimes ultimately motivated by the desire to do the just or moral thing for its own sake. Sometimes when you do something good for someone else, sometimes when you pass by someone who asks you for money and you decide, this person really seems to need help, I'm going to sacrifice just a little bit and give them a bit of money, or maybe go buy them something to eat. Sometimes, maybe not always, but Socrates' claim is that sometimes when we do things like that, we're doing it just because it's the right thing to do. We would, in other words, still do it even if it had no good consequences for us. We were sure no one was looking, and we were sure that this person would never pay us back. And we weren't scared of the consequences of failing to do something good. None of that is what motivates us. It's just, this person is in need, it's the right thing to help them, so I'm going to do it. Socrates says, maybe not always, but sometimes at least, we are motivated in that way. We have an ultimate desire that's not an egoistic one. So you can see that if Socrates is right about this, our moral behavior then is not always ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. For all Socrates says, maybe sometimes it is, but his claim is we're at least capable of being ultimately motivated by non-egoistic considerations, especially when we do something that's good or sacrificial for another person. So you can already begin to see, if Socrates is right, then psychological egoism is false. Psychological egoism makes this broad claim that everything we do is ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. And Socrates is like, not everything. Sometimes we just do the right thing for the right reasons, doing something good for its own sake. And that's enough, if he's right, to show that psychological egoism is false. So enter Glaucon and his brother later, Adeimantus. This is actually, that's not Glaucon and Adeimantus, but it's a scene from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where they go back in time and see Socrates, who I think they call Socrates, but we can pretend that Bill and Ted there are Glaucon and Adeimantus. Glaucon and Adeimantus don't necessarily disagree with Socrates. They are instead, you can think of them as playing devil's advocate. They kind of want Socrates to be right, but they also want to press him, and they want to put his claim to the test. So they're going to take on the mantle of a psychological egoist to some extent and see whether Socrates' claim stands up to scrutiny. So Glaucon says this: I want to hear what justice and injustice are. Again, that's the sort of central question of the Republic. And what power each has when it is just by itself in the soul. What does that mean? Well, he says, I want to leave out of account the rewards and the consequences of each of them. So he's asking Socrates, look, you think that this justice thing, this rightness, this doing the right thing, you think that that's desirable and good just all by itself. In fact, you think its possession in the soul makes a soul just thereby, just by being just, makes that soul better somehow, regardless of its consequences. So you need to be able to tell me, how does that work? How exactly, if it's not about the social rewards for doing the right thing, how does doing the right thing, how is that desirable in and of itself? So, in effect, Socrates' thesis says that our moral behavior is ultimately motivated by a commitment to morality or justice for its own sake. And Glaucon is noticing here that, like, when we look around in the actual world, plenty of people do just or moral things for one another, and we tend to refrain from behaving immorally, and that's just in ways that's considered immoral by other people. We tend to, for the most part, try hard to stay on the straight and narrow. But that alone doesn't tell us anything about the motivations for why it is that people act justly and avoid injustice. This is doubly an issue because the way we've actually structured our societies in general is that those who do good for others tend to get some kind of social reward. It's not necessarily true that if you sacrifice a lot for other people, you'll always, do well in your career or something. Sadly, that's not the way it goes. But it is true, I think, by and large, that there is a people like, this is one way to put it, people tend to like good people, and people tend to dislike those who cheat them, and that all by itself is a kind of positive reinforcement. And conversely, cheaters and scammers and liars and thieves, those people, when they're caught, society treats them harshly. I mean, we have a criminal justice system, and people who violate our laws are fined, sometimes go to prison, and often will face social ostracization. I don't know if I said that word right, as a result of getting caught. So when we look around and we see, like, it's actually kind of in my self-interest to do the right thing in our actual society, and it's really not in my self-interest to take a risk and try to cheat and hope I get away with it. That kind of makes Socrates' thesis difficult to test in the real world, because what we want to know is, what are my actual underlying motives? Is it the self-interest that I'm after, or is it the just doing the right thing? And so Glaucon's idea is that if we're going to really test Socrates' thesis, we shouldn't just look at the actual world we find ourselves in. We also need to consider, and this is what would actually test the thesis better, we need to consider how we would behave if the rewards and benefits that moral behavior actually gets you were absent, and if the punishments for immoral behavior were absent. If those were gone, would you still behave morally? The answer to that question will tell us whether Socrates' thesis is true or false, is Glaucon's idea.